Feldwebel Karl Rettinger has the whole road to himself, and he likes it that way. His Panther rolls north out of Bourcy toward Noville at first light, engine warm, 75mm gun laid straight down the axis of the road, and the fog is doing exactly what fog is supposed to do for the man with the thicker armor. It hides him and slows everyone else. He knows the numbers. His glacis plate is 80mm of sloped steel, angled so severely that most American shot skids off it, like a stone off a frozen pond. His gun can kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, which is farther than most men can even see on a clear day, let alone this one. Behind him, 4 more Panthers grind forward in column, and the crews are relaxed in the way that only technical superiority makes a man relaxed. They have driven through the American 7th Armored before. The machine under Rettinger weighs 45 tons and moves like it resents the ground. Nothing on this road can trade blows with it and live, and every crewman in that column believes it, and they are, on paper, completely correct. Then, the second Panther in line stops being a tank and becomes a fireball, and the third one loses its commander before anyone in the column has heard the sound that did it. Here is the part that shouldn't work. The thing killing Rettinger's column that morning is an American M10 tank destroyer, and by every specification that matters, the M10 is the worse machine. Its armor is thin enough that a Panther's gun goes through it front, back, or sideways without slowing down. Its turret is open at the top, which means the crew fights in the weather and dies to airburst shrapnel that a real tank would shrug off. It turns that turret by hand, crank slowly, a man's arm against 40 tons of geometry, and it cannot run. Top speed on a good road is around 25 miles an hour, bicycle fast, which means the one thing the M10 absolutely cannot do is outrun the Panther that is about to want it dead. So here is the riddle. This whole video exists to answer. How do 4 machines that are slower, thinner-skinned, and outgunned ambush a column of the best medium tank Germany fielded, destroy it, and vanish before the Germans can turn and fire back? That is not a fair fight, and it did not go the way fairness predicts. Hollywood won't touch this one, because the answer is doctrine and geometry and a 3-inch gun, and none of that fits in a trailer, which is exactly why this channel exists, and why a like, a subscribe, and a comment telling me what you'd have done in Rettinger's seat are the only fuel that keeps these going. The answer starts with the fact the Germans understood perfectly and could do nothing about, and I want to be careful here, because it's easy to turn this into a fairy tale, and it wasn't one. The M10 was not a good tank. The men who crewed it said so themselves, and the ordnance reports use words like inadequate about its armor without any prompting from me. What the M10 had was a gun that could hurt a Panther and a design philosophy that told the crew to never, ever be where the Panther expected them. American Tank Destroyer doctrine, the doctrine that everybody after the war decided was wrong, said something almost insulting in its simplicity. Don't fight tanks like a tank. Don't sit and slug. Hide, wait, shoot the flank, and leave before the target can answer. The Panther's great virtue was that 80mm glacis, all that beautifully sloped frontal steel, and the M10 crews were trained to simply refuse to shoot at it. They shot at the side, where the Panther carried 40mm of vertical plate that a 3-inch shell opened like a tin can. The whole German advantage lived in one direction, straight ahead, and the entire American plan was to never be straight ahead. You might think a slower vehicle is always the loser in a tank fight. Over open ground, chasing or being chased, that's true. But an ambush isn't a race. An ambush is a question of who fires first, from a place the other man didn't check, and speed has nothing to do with that. 25 miles an hour is plenty when you're already stopped. Engine off, gun laid on a spot in the road you picked an hour ago in the dark. Rettinger's column had every material advantage and one fatal assumption, which was that superiority in a straight line is the same thing as superiority. It isn't. The fog that hid him hid them better. The confidence that let his crew's ride relax through Noville was the exact confidence a good ambush is built to punish. Somewhere in the tree line off the Noville road, 4 open-topped, thin-skinned, 25-mile-an-hour American machines sat cold and silent and waited for the best tank on the field to drive its unarmored flank across their sights. To understand how it happened and how they were gone before the surviving Panthers could even swing their turrets, we have to go back a few hours to the men, the ground, and a gun that the Germans respected a great deal more than they respected the vehicle carrying it. The gun tube on a 3-inch M7 measures a little over 12 feet from breech to muzzle, and a man of the 601st could tell you its temperament the way a farrier knows a horse. That gun was not designed for the M10 at all. It started life as an anti-aircraft piece, then a towed anti-tank gun, and it came to the battalion through a chain of compromises that the men firing it neither knew nor cared about. What they cared about was that it worked. It threw a 15-pound armor-piercing shot fast enough to punch a Panther's flank at 1,000 yards, and it did so with a recoil that rocked 40 tons of vehicle back on its springs. Everything else about the M10 was a bargain struck to carry that gun somewhere useful. The men carrying it were the oldest hands in the business. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion was the first American TD unit to fight the Germans anywhere, and it paid for that distinction in Tunisia in the winter and spring of 1943. So what did Tunisia teach them? It taught them the cost of getting it wrong in one afternoon on ground that did not forgive. At El Guetar, in March of 1943, the battalion stood in the path of the 10th Panzer Division and fought it to a standstill, and the after-action numbers are the kind that get a unit a presidential citation. But that is the clean version. The dirty version is that the 601st bled to learn what it learned. Earlier, around Sidi Bou Zid and the wreck of Kasserine, American tank destroyers had been thrown at German armor like cavalry, sent charging into the teeth of guns that outranged them, and they had been slaughtered for it. The doctrine on paper said, seek, strike, destroy, aggressive words, and men died proving the words were half wrong. You could seek, you could strike. But if you struck from the front, at range, against a dug-in enemy who saw you coming, destroy was the one verb you did not get to keep. The survivors drew the conclusion that no field manual had printed yet. Stop charging. Start waiting. By the time the 601st reached Europe by way of Italy and southern France, the men had rewritten their own trade in the margins of the official book. The lesson was simple, and it was written in the names of dead crews. The M10's thin hide meant you only survived the fight you started on your own terms, from a flank, from cover, with the first shot already aimed before the enemy knew you existed. A veteran gunner learned to read ground, the way an old poacher reads a hedgerow, where the road forced a tank to slow, where a tree line gave you a hull-down berth, which way the enemy's turret would naturally point so you could set up 90 degrees off it. The open turret that everyone complained about, the one that let in rain and shrapnel, also let the commander stand up and see and hear the whole battlefield in a way a buttoned-up Panther crew never could. A German tank commander fighting closed down sees the world through a slit. The M10 commander, freezing and exposed, saw everything. It was a miserable trade that happened to be the right one for an ambush. Then the war did what wars do and moved faster than the plan. In December of 1944, the German counteroffensive came out of the Ardennes fog, and units that had expected a quiet winter sector found themselves in the way of an army. The ground was frozen hard, the fog sat in the valleys for days, and the roads, the few real roads through that broken country, became the whole war. Armor could not maneuver cross-country through the forest and the snow. Armor had to use the roads, and a road is just an ambush that hasn't been sprung yet, if you know the ground and the other man is in a hurry. The cold was not scenery here, it was a weapon. At dawn, the temperature sat below freezing, and the men of the tank destroyer crews had spent the night not sleeping in open-top steel boxes, gun oil going stiff, breath frosting on the inside of the fighting compartment, the smell of cordite from the day before still soaked into the ready rounds stacked at their knees. You do not stay warm in an M10. You stay ready, or you stay nothing. The German columns, by contrast, had to run their engines to keep moving, and a running Panther in still cold air can be heard long before it is seen. The fog that blinded everyone favored the man who was already stopped, already laid on the road, already listening. Everything converged here. A gun that was never meant for the vehicle. A battalion that had buried enough friends in Africa to distrust its own doctrine and fix it. A machine everyone agreed was inadequate, crewed by men who had turned its every weakness into the specific conditions of a trap. And a German offensive that, by its own logic and its own timetable, had no choice but to send its best tanks down narrow roads at first light, straight past tree lines, where cold men sat waiting with the gun already aimed. The pieces were all on the table now. What happened next took about 4 minutes. So why not use the fast one? The Army had a faster tank destroyer, and it was better on paper than the M10 in almost every way that a recruiting poster would care about. The M18 Hellcat could do better than 50 miles an hour on a road, twice what the M10 managed, and it carried the same class of gun. If speed were the answer to hunting Panthers, the choice would have been obvious, and the 601st would have traded up the moment the Hellcats came off the line. But the men who had fought in Tunisia had already learned the thing that the speed numbers hid, and it is worth saying plainly, because it runs against every instinct. In an ambush, speed is the thing you use last, not first. You use it to leave. You do not use it to arrive, because arriving fast means arriving loud, and the whole point is that the enemy never learns you were there until his second tank is burning. The 601st fought in M10s through the Ardennes, not because the M10 was better, but because it was the vehicle they had, crewed by men who had spent a year turning its faults into a method. A worse machine in expert hands beats a better machine used the way the enemy expects. That is the entire history of the 601st, written in one sentence, and it is no slogan. Concealment is the part nobody puts on a spec sheet, and it was the M10's real weapon. A Panther announces itself. It weighs 45 tons. Its engine is a supercharged roar in the cold, and moving it means throwing up snow and exhaust and the deep mechanical grinding that carries for a mile through still Ardennes air. An M10 sitting in a tree line with its engine off makes no sound at all. It is a cold shape among cold shapes, its long gun laid flat and level, and pointing at a spot on the road that the crew chose in the dark hours before. Everything the German crew relied on to find threats worked against motion, against noise, against heat, and the ambushing M10 offered none of those. The Panther commander, buttoned down against the shrapnel that the fog and the fighting had taught him to fear, was looking through a vision slit the width of a mail slot, and the world through that slit was gray fog, and gray road, and more gray fog. He was not going to see a stationary vehicle tucked into a hedge at 90 degrees to his line of march. He was, in the most literal sense, driving blind past a loaded gun, and he had no way to know it. Now put the two facts together, because this is where every American disadvantage flips over and becomes an advantage. The M10 is thin-skinned, but a vehicle that fires first from cover does not need armor, because the enemy never gets the shot that armor is for. The M10 is slow, but a vehicle that is already stopped does not need to be fast to be in position, and it only needs to move once the killing is done. Its turret cranks by hand, but a gun already laid on the target has no need to traverse because the target is going to drive into the crosshairs on its own. Every weakness the ordnance reports listed assumed a stand-up fight, a fair fight, the kind the Germans wanted, and the kind the 601st had learned in blood never to give them. Refuse the fair fight, and the weaknesses stop mattering. The trick, which is no trick at all, is just refusing to fight the war the enemy has prepared for. And then there is the shot itself, the flank hit, the thing the whole setup exists to produce. A Panther is a fortress from the front and a filing cabinet from the side. 80 millimeters of sloped glacis versus 40 millimeters of flat plate over the engine and the crew compartment, and the 3-inch shot does not so much penetrate that side plate as ignore it. Set your ambush at 90 degrees to the road. Wait for the column to present its long, unprotected flank as it passes, and the first round goes through the side, into the fighting compartment, or the engine or the ammunition, and a 45-ton tank becomes a fireball before the men inside have processed that they are under fire. The first shot is the whole battle, not the first minute, not the first exchange. The first shot, aimed and laid before the enemy, knew a fight existed. Miss it, or fire it from the front, and you are the one who dies. Land it in the flank, and the Panther's superiority in armor and gun and speed all arrive too late to matter, because the crew that would have used them is already dead or bailing out into the snow. This is why they hunted the best tank in Europe with a machine the army itself called inadequate, not despite the M10's faults, but by building a method in which those faults could not be reached. Cold, silent, hidden, patient, laid on a spot in the road with the range already set and the gun already loaded. 4 crews of the 601st waited outside Noville for Feldwebel Rettinger's column to do the one thing a road force's armor to do: show its side. Everything that follows happened in the time it takes to read this paragraph aloud. The lead gunner has his crosshair sitting on an empty patch of road, and he does not move it. That is the discipline the whole thing runs on. There's a Panther coming. He can hear it. The whole crew can hear it. That low grinding roar rolling up the grade from Borsy through fog thick enough to hide a house. Every instinct in a man's body says, traverse toward the sound, find the thing, point the gun at the threat. He does the opposite. He keeps the tube laid on a stretch of open road 40 yards to his left, a spot the tank has not reached yet, because he is not aiming at where the Panther is. He is aiming at where it will be. This is the part that separates the 601st from men who died learning. You do not chase the target with the gun. You pick the killing ground, you lay on it cold, and you let the enemy drive into it on his own power. The road out of Borsy bends and climbs here, and armor climbing a grade in fog goes slow and goes predictable, and a slow, predictable target crossing left to right at 40 yards is not a hard shot. It is the easiest shot in gunnery. The only hard part is the waiting, and the waiting is the whole job. Rettinger's lead Panther comes out of the murk exactly where the road says it must, and the gunner still does not fire. He lets it pass. Lead vehicle rolls through the crosshair and keeps going, up the road unmolested, and every second it lives is a second closer to the moment when the whole column is inside the trap at once. You do not shoot the first tank you see. You shoot when the most guns can hit the most targets, because the ambush that kills one Panther and warns 4 is a failure, and the men who set this one had buried enough friends in Africa to know the difference, so the lead tank drives on. The second closes into the gap. The third grinds up behind it. And the fog that Rettinger loved, the fog that hid him and slowed everyone else, is now packing his column nose to tail into a stretch of road that 4 American guns have already ranged in the dark. Then the shape fills the crosshair, 40 yards, broadside, that long flat flank sliding across the reticle exactly as planned, and the lead gunner fires. The 3-inch M7 goes off, and the whole M10 rocks back on its springs, the recoil slamming through the open fighting compartment, a wall of muzzle blast flattening the frost off the branches in front of them. 15 pounds of armor-piercing shot crosses 40 yards in a time too short to measure and goes into the Panther's flank the way the manual promised, through 40 millimeters of vertical plate that might as well not be there. It does not bounce. It does not skid the way it would off that beautiful glacis. It punches into the fighting compartment, and whatever it finds in there, crew, propellant, the racked rounds for that fine 75 millimeter gun, it finds it at more than 2,000 feet per second. The tank that was a fortress a half second ago opens up from the inside, and now all 4 guns are firing. The 601st reported the effect in the flat, deliberate language that unit records use, the language that never raises its voice. The enemy tanks were engaged and destroyed before they could return effective fire. That is the after-action phrasing. What it means, translated back into the road outside Noville that morning, is that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Panthers were being killed 1 and 2 at a time in the span of seconds, each one taking a flank hit from a gun it never located, each crew's last confused thought being some version of where. Where is it? A tank commander buttoned down against shrapnel, staring through a vision slit into gray fog. Here's his own engine, and the tank ahead of him, and then a hammer blow into the side of his own vehicle, and he has nowhere to look because the muzzle flashes are inside a tree line at 90 degrees, and by the time he could crank his turret toward them, it would already be too late, and it is already too late. You cannot fight what you cannot find. The Panther's gun could kill at 2,000 meters, and here at 40 yards that reach was worth exactly nothing, because reach only matters when you know which direction to point it. The German advantage lived in one direction, straight down the road, and the 601st had spent a year and a lot of dead men learning to attack from the only direction that advantage did not cover. Every asset Rettinger's column carried into the fog, the armor, the gun, the training, the fog itself, was built for a fight where both sides can see each other. This was not that fight. This was execution, and the machine everyone called inadequate was doing the executing. The column had rolled into the corridor confident and relaxed, superior in every specification that a specification sheet could hold. In under a minute, it was a line of burning steel on a frozen road, and the men who had killed it had not yet moved a single vehicle. The killing had been the easy part. What came next was the danger. The smell hits before anything makes sense. Hot copper and scorched paint, and the sweet chemical reek of burning cordite venting up through a hatch that will not open fast enough. Inside the second Panther, the loader is on his knees in a compartment that has gone from cold to furnace in the space of a heartbeat. And the thing he cannot understand, the thing his mind keeps snagging on, is that there was no warning, no incoming whistle, no muzzle flash in the vision block. The tank ahead of him was rolling, and then it was a torch. And now, his own vehicle has taken a blow to the flank that felt like God swinging a sledge, and the commander overhead is screaming a single word into the intercom. Target. Give me a target. There is no target. That is the horror of it. A tank crew is trained to fight, and fighting means finding the enemy and pointing the gun and firing back, and every step of that sequence assumes the enemy can be found. Rettinger's men have run into a fight where the first step is impossible. The gunner in the third Panther cranks his turret toward where he thinks the shot came from, right into the tree line, and he is guessing because 40 yards of fog and a 90-degree deflection give him nothing but gray. He traverses toward a sound he cannot separate from his own engine and the burning of the tanks around him. He is turning his turret toward a hedge, and the hedge is not where the gun is, and even if it were, the second American round is already in the air, 3 rounds per gun. That was the discipline on the American side, and it is worth stating in the flat arithmetic of it, because arithmetic is what killed these men. 4 guns, 3 aimed shots apiece in the first half-minute, each one laid on a flank at point-blank range, where the 3-inch shot did not need to be lucky. The German crews were not being outfought in any sense they would have recognized. They were being processed. Feldwebel Rettinger's own tank, up front, is the one that survives longest, because it cleared the killing stretch before the first shot, and the guns were laid behind him. He hears it in his headset and sees it in his mirrors, his column dying in his wake, one flat crack and then a fireball, another crack and another fireball, marching back down the line toward the tail. He does the only thing a competent commander can do, which is order his gun around and look for the enemy. And here is the bitter joke of the whole morning. Turning the best tank gun in Europe toward a tree line it cannot see into accomplishes exactly nothing. The 75-millimeter gun that could kill a Sherman at a mile is a crowbar in a room with no door. He has all the firepower and none of the information, and firepower without information is just noise. What the German crews said in that moment survives only in fragments, and the record here is thin. The men best placed to describe it were dead within the minute. But the pattern of the reaction is not a mystery, because German tankers who lived through American flank ambushes elsewhere describe the same thing again and again to their interrogators afterward. And the word that recurs in those reports is a plain one: helpless, not outgunned, not outnumbered, helpless, which is a different and worse thing. One Panzer officer, captured later in the campaign and recorded at length, put it in a sentence that gets quoted because it is exact. You cannot shoot what you cannot see, and by the time you see the American tank destroyer, you are already dead. He was not describing this specific column on this specific road. He did not need to be. He was describing the method, and the method was the same everywhere the 601st practiced it. Inside the burning Panthers, the crews who could still move were doing the last thing the vehicle asks of them, which is to get out. A tank fire does not wait. Propellant goes first, then the stored rounds, and the interior becomes a place no living thing can stay. And so the hatches came open, and men came out into the snow, some burning, some already hit, all of them stepping down into a field of fire they still could not locate. That was its own trap. A crewman bailing out of a stricken tank at 40 yards is in the open, in the killing ground, and the tree line that had ignored him while he was buttoned up now had a clean look at him in the road. The fog that Rettinger had blessed at dawn hid nothing that mattered now, and hid everything that would have saved them. It took less time than reloading takes to describe. A column of the finest tanks Germany could field, crewed by men who knew their trade, rolled into a stretch of Belgian road superior in armor and gun and doctrine, and left it as a row of hulks throwing black smoke into the freezing dawn. They had come looking for a fight and found an execution. And the distinction between those two things is the entire difference between the war the Germans expected that morning and the war they got. The guns that did it had not moved an inch. 700 and change, and the whole thing is already over. Sources do not agree on the exact minute the firing started, and the after-action paperwork rounds it off the way tired men round things off. But the shape of it is not in doubt. 4 minutes of shooting, maybe a little less. Then, a silence broken only by the roar of tanks burning and the small sounds a wrecked column makes when the men who can still walk are crawling away from it. Now comes the part the Germans never got to answer, and it is the part the entire method was built around. A column has been gutted. Its spearhead is a line of hulks, and the guns that did it are about to do the one thing that turns an ambush into a disappearance. They leave. This is where the M10's despised 25 miles an hour stops mattering, because the drive back does not need speed. It needs a head start, and the head start is total. No German gun in that column ever fired an aimed round at an American vehicle. Turn that over for a second. The Panther carried the finest tank gun in the theater, crewed by men who had killed Shermans at a mile, and not one of those guns put steel on an M10, because you cannot range what you cannot find, and by the time you might have found it, it was reversing out of its firing position, with its engine finely lit and the fog closing behind it like a curtain. The engines that had sat cold and silent through the whole approach came alive only when the killing was done, and the sound of them starting was lost inside the roar of Panthers cooking off. The crews backed the guns off their firing line one at a time, down the reverse slope, onto whatever track had brought them up in the dark. This was the rehearsed part, the unglamorous part no recruiting poster wants. You do not linger to admire the work, you displace. The 601st had learned in Tunisia that the tank destroyer which stays to watch its kills burn is the tank destroyer that eats the counter-battery fire, and so the discipline that governed the withdrawal was the same discipline that had held the gunner's crosshair on empty road. Get in cold, kill fast, get out before the enemy learns which direction to be angry at. And the cruel arithmetic of the morning is the gap between what the Germans intended and what they got. This column had rolled north to seize a corridor. That was the mission. Open the road, push through Noville, keep the offensive moving on the timetable that the whole Ardennes gamble depended on. Instead, the corridor swallowed the spearhead. The advance meant to take ground, lost the tanks it needed to take ground with, and it lost them without inflicting a scratch on the force that killed them. You send your best armor to open a door, and it comes back as smoke, and the men who shut the door in your face are already 3 ridgelines away, drinking cold coffee. That is not a defeat a commander can even file properly, because there is no enemy strength to report and no line that broke. There is only a road that was yours a minute ago and is a graveyard now. Feldwebel Rettinger, up at the head, lived. The lead tank almost always did in a trap laid this way, because the geometry sacrifices the lead vehicle's kill in exchange for catching the body of the column, and Rettinger had driven clear of the killing stretch before the first shot. He got to keep his tank and his crew and the rest of his life. What he did not get was a single clean look at what had killed the 4 machines behind him. He would have swung that 75 toward the tree line. The record from ambushes like this one says the survivors always did, and found gray fog, empty hedge, and the fading sound of engines going the wrong way. A crowbar in a room with no door, and now not even a door to swing it at. The German account of the Noville fighting is thin on this specific column, and I will not pretend otherwise. The men who could have described the inside of it did not survive to be interrogated, and the fragments that do exist fold this action into the larger confusion of those days around Bastogne. But the broader German assessment of American tank destroyers in exactly this role is not thin at all, and it says the same flat thing the survivors always said. You never saw the gun that killed you. By the time you saw it, it was gone. Gone before the guns traversed. That is not a figure of speech. It is the literal sequence of the morning. The American guns had finished, displaced, and cleared the ridge before the German turrets completed the traverse toward where the shots had come from. The traverse was still turning toward an empty tree line when the ambush was already miles into its withdrawal. 4 open-topped, thin-skinned, slow hand-crank machines that the Army's own reports called inadequate had met the best tank Germany could build, on ground and in weather the Germans had chosen, and had beaten it so completely that the enemy never located the fight he lost. The specifications said the M10 should not have won. The specifications were describing a different war than the one the 600 first decided to fight. General Major Fritz Bayerlein sat down after the war and did the thing losing generals do when the Americans hand them a pencil and a paycheck. He explained in careful bureaucratic German exactly how he had been beaten. His reports for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program run to hundreds of pages, and buried in the flat prose about the Ardennes is a complaint that sounds almost like a man describing bad weather. American anti-tank guns and tank destroyers, he wrote, seem to be everywhere and nowhere, engaging from concealment and gone before his tanks could reply. He does not name the 600 first. He does not name the road outside Noville. He is describing a texture, a thing that happened to his columns over and over until the pattern was the point. That is the verdict, and no propaganda office produced it. It came from the men who lost, writing for the men who won, with no reason left to flatter anybody. Read enough of the FMS material, and a strange chorus builds. The German officers, given a captive audience and a war to relitigate, keep circling back to the same handful of things that undid them in the West, and the tank destroyer sitting silent in a tree line is on the list right next to the fighter bomber and the endless American artillery. What is striking is what they do not say. They never complain that the M10 outran the Panther because it did not, or that its armor was thicker because it was laughable, or that its gun was better when the gun was merely adequate. They complain about being hit from a direction they had not cleared, by a weapon they never located, laid by men who had already left. In other words, they lost to a method, and the method embarrassed them more than any machine could have. You can hear the ego in it if you listen. A tank general can accept being beaten by a better tank. That is a fair fight, an engineering problem, a thing you fix with a thicker plate and a bigger gun. What Bayerlein and his colleagues could not comfortably accept was being processed by inferior equipment used correctly, and so the reports reach for the language of the uncanny. Everywhere and nowhere, ghosts, guns that fire once and vanish. There were no ghosts. There were open-top Detroit machines with hand-cranked traverse and a crew of tired Americans who had learned in Tunisia to pick the killing ground and leave before the bill came due. And here is the part the specification sheet never captured, the part that actually broke the Panthers in the Ardennes. The thing that beat Rettinger's column was not a vehicle at all. It was a decision made years earlier and thousands of miles away, in an army that chose to build tank destroyers by the thousand, and then spend blood teaching men to use them as an ambush weapon rather than a dueling one. The M10 was mediocre steel wrapped around a correct idea, and correct ideas, manufactured at American scale and handed to men allowed to learn from their own dead, turned out to be worth more than the finest tank in Europe, driven straight down a foggy road on a timetable. The Germans understood industrial power when it fell on them as bombs. They understood it more slowly when it arrived as doctrine, as the unglamorous fact that the United States could afford to build a flawed weapon in enormous numbers, distribute it to a battalion, let that battalion get mauled in Africa, and trust the survivors to figure out how to make the flawed weapon lethal. That is a kind of wealth that does not show up in a comparison of armor thickness. It is the wealth of being able to be wrong on purpose and still win, and it is the thing the FMS reports keep groping toward without quite naming. Bayerling filed his pages. The interrogators typed up the Panzer officers who said helpless and everywhere and gone. The 601st, for its part, kept doing the same thing up and down the Ardennes for the rest of that winter, because the method worked and there was no reason to improve on it, and improvement was never the American advantage anyway. Quantity, applied intelligently, was. Somewhere in the days after Noville, a German staff officer sat down to account for the tanks his division no longer had. He had a form for it. Losses due to enemy action, and a column for the cause, and he needed to write down what had killed 4 Panthers on a road his side had chosen, in weather his side had blessed. The honest entry would have been that his best armor drove into a tree line full of vehicles his own high command considered inadequate, and died without landing a blow, against men who were already gone by the time the smoke cleared. That does not fit in a box on a form. So he wrote enemy tank destroyers, or enemy anti-tank fire, some tidy phrase that filed the thing away and explained nothing, and he moved his pencil down to the next line, because there were more tanks to account for, and the offensive was still, officially, on schedule. He kept writing. The schedule by then was the only thing still advancing,